Bay Area Latin America Forum of the semester. We are very pleased to have Giovanni Peri with us today. Giovanni is a professor of economics at UC Davis, and he got his PhD here at UC Berkeley. He is also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and he's in the editorial board of several journals. So please join me in welcoming Giovanni Peri today.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mariana, for the kind introduction, and thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to be here in Berkeley. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the point of view of an economist in terms of what are the consequences of immigration and of this potential immigration reform that are being discussed, although not too much these days. So let me start, and I don't want to scare you with numbers. There won't be too many numbers. Notice that in the building, not even the floor is a number, so I don't want to put too much of those. But the starting point of my research is trying to learn important facts about immigration that are useful for policy. So here I put the quotes of two relevant figures. One is the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon that last month was opening this high dialogue on migration and said migration policies should be guided by facts rather than hunches and hearsay. And then President Obama, trying to push the current immigration reform, says together we can build a fair, effective, and common sense immigration system that lives up to our heritage as a nation of laws and a nation of immigrants. So it is important to understand the facts of immigration and some of the consequences to do good policies. So first, I'm going to give you some numbers to put in frame and to put in perspective the migration as a world phenomenon and then as a US phenomenon. So if you take the world as a whole, less than 3% of the people in the world are migrants, so live in a different country from when they are born. So this is a small number, really. However, if you look at rich OECD, the OECD is the club of the rich countries. If you look at rich countries, 10% of the population on average is made by immigrants, which means that a lot of those migrants, which are not a ton in world scale, are actually going to the rich countries. And this percentage actually has increased a lot in the last 20 years. If you measure this in 1990, this was about 4 or 5%. Moreover, I have been using recently this very interesting data that Gallup, which is a poll organization, does in the world. Moreover, there are a lot of more people who say they would like to migrate if they had the opportunity. The opportunity being unclear if it is a visa or a job opportunity. But if you follow some of this number that comes from World Poll, about 9% of the world population would actually like to live in another country, to migrate somewhere else. And even more than this 9%, and then an additional 15% will actually like to at least temporarily be abroad. So this gives us an idea that the current immigration restrictions in the world are making the world a place where migration is much smaller than it could potentially be. So this is the world. Only this sliver of people are the actual migrants. But reasonably, if the rich country would allow a little bit more of these migrants, a whole 1/4 of the world population will be either potentially permanent or potentially temporary migrant. So this is to say that there is a big margin there, and a very interesting margin if a rich country relax a little bit the draconian restriction on immigration that they have. Let's go to the US. The US, by far, is the biggest destination of migrants. In terms of number, there is not even one every 5 migrants in the world goes to the United States. And interestingly, California is an even stronger attractor. So the US attracts 20% of the migrants, and the US is about 4% of the world population. California, with only 0.5% of the world population, so California only has 1/200th of the world population, attracts 1/20th of the migrant, 1 out of every 20 migrants. And when you look at the question from the Gallup polls of how many people would like, if they had a chance to go to the United States, not only the United States is the biggest actual destination, but it would be the biggest desired destination if people could go. 23% would go to the US. So there is a potential 150 million people in the world who, when polled, say they would like to go on top of the one which are already here. And so here is a map which is interesting. If you take this Gallup poll and you put people where they would like to be rather than when they are, if you put people who are potential migrants in the country of destination, the United States and Canada are two countries whose population will increase between 50 and 90%. So that by far will be the country that will be more affected. Australia, in percentage term, also largely, Europe much less, and some country, of course, will lose some of the people. So this is the world perspective. Now, I talked about this potential migrant because I want to start looking at migration from an economic point of view. And migration from an economical point of view is an incredible opportunity. It's an incredible opportunity for a receiving country and for migrants. Why? Think a little bit about it. Even if you don't know anything about economics, there are economic gains when people can exchange different things. If we all have apples, there is nothing to exchange. But if I have apples and you have oranges, it's good to exchange. If we all have the same skills, there is no particularly advantage in having a lot of people. But if we have different skills, then putting us together, we can produce and do different things. So the two words that economists use are complementarities, meaning different type of workers have different type of skills, and putting them together, the productivity goes up. And exchange, when you have people who are different from you, that produce different services, different goods, different type of foods, is good to exchange. So why are immigrants potentially a great economic opportunity? Because they're different from the receiving country. And here I put some dimension on which they are different from the population of the receiving country that makes them economically, I'm talking economically today, yeah? I know that then economically it makes them particularly interesting. I will talk a little bit more, but if we're talking about workers who have relatively low education, immigrants have very strong differences in terms of they are, on average, much younger than natives. People migrate when they are younger. And they are more willing and able, not more able, but they're much more willing, and they're also able to do manual type of jobs that native people in rich countries are progressively moving out of. And then they also have different place of origin, which generate a difference in culture, which is interesting from a consumption point of view. They produce different goods, they produce different services. And people are better off when they have a variety of goods and services to choose from. Among the more educated, on the other hand, the immigrants are much more focused, people who come from abroad, on science, technology, engineering, and math. Probably because these things are more easier to transfer across country. You can learn them and apply. And if you look at the migrant, I'm going to show you a picture, you're going to see that a lot of them are in these science, technology, engineering, and math, and much fewer are in sort of law type of occupation or language-based type of occupation. And second, the highly educated immigrants are also more mobile internally in the United States. Once they come in the US, they are more willing to go and take a job from Texas to California if the opportunity arises, responding to the incentive. So this is an interesting graph that I always show, and this shows the percentage of immigrants in different groups of workers in the United States, starting with workers with low level of education. This is the group of workers who don't have a high school diploma and work in manual type of services. These are workers who have a high school diploma, some college, associate college, bachelor, master, PhD, and PhD in science and technology. So you see that at the two extremes of this, there is a massive presence of immigrants. Immigrants are 40% of the manual workers, 0.4, of the manual workers in the United States, and they are 40% of the high educated in science and engineering. And there is less in between in here, in those type of jobs which require more communication, interaction, where the immigrant, not knowing the language in details, have a little bit of, they have less, the economists say they have less of a comparative advantage. They have a comparative advantage down here if they are highly educated, or down here if they are less educated. So let me talk a little bit about the specific gains for, economic gains for the United States in receiving these immigrants. So let's start from this group of immigrants. So I'm going to particularly focus on receiving a lot of low-skilled immigrants, which are manual workers, and high-skilled immigrants, which are scientists and engineers. What does this do to our economy? And what does this do to native workers? So The gains from the receiving economy point of view comes from the fact that less educated immigrants tend to concentrate in occupation, I'm going to give you some examples, which are particularly manual intensive. And these are the same occupation that native, because they're getting more educated and they're getting older, are moving out at a relatively fast pace. Now, this type of analysis implies that immigrants tend to be more complementary than competitor with the native worker on the labor market, on the job market. In a way that is easier to translate when you read this stuff in the press. The question that the press asks is, do immigrants take jobs away from native, or do they actually take jobs, sometimes they say that native don't want, or creating different opportunities? So the question is, do immigrants take this job, and these jobs are not there anymore from native, or do immigrants take these jobs, and native as a consequence have more opportunity elsewhere, move elsewhere? And I would say that overwhelmingly, my research in the last 5 years is a story of this complementarity between immigrant and native doing slightly different things, and when they come together, increasing the productivity of firms. For instance, let me give you an example. Let's take a sector like the agricultural sector, and let's take people who don't have a high school degree. Sorry, who have a high school degree or less. So, low educated. And let's look at two very specific occupations, one which is called agricultural laborer and one which is called farm coordinator. Now you see, and this is the percentage of foreign-born. You see that the foreign-born overwhelmingly are in the job which is called agricultural laborer, which is manual. These are the people who pick the fruit and cultivate the land. While very few immigrants, only 4%, 6% of the farm coordinator are natives. Now, farm coordinator needs the worker in order to make the farm work. And with more workers, there is more need for coordination. So in a sense, you can say that when there are more agricultural workers, the demand for farm coordinator goes up. Going to construction, there is a work which is called construction helper and one which is called construction supervisor. Immigrants are a huge share of construction helper, but a very small share of construction supervisor. They come in, they supply the work on those jobs, and they create a big demand, though, for construction supervisor. The sites increase, the construction sites increase, and a lot of these natives that work in this type of jobs actually have a higher demand. Or go look at all the other maps, for instance, in transportation, taxi driver and supervisor of motor vehicle operators. You need the taxi driver to drive, but then you need some person who keep the vehicle and the motor vehicle operation in place, and immigrants are much more here. These require more interaction with the customers, with the people who are supplying services. So the idea is that when immigrants who have a low level of education come in, take manual jobs, they tend to create demand for this more coordination and more language-intensive type of jobs, and in a sense push up the native into this type of job, which, by the way, pay a little bit better. So that's why economists do not really find the negative effect of immigrants on wages of native, because they don't do the same thing, because they generate a response from native that specialize them and increase the productivity. And sometimes also economists find that firms reorganize their production a little bit in order to take advantage of this. One job, like the taxi industry, 40 years ago, the same person was driving the taxi, making the phone call, keeping the accounting of the firm. Now the firm has taxi driver who are specialized, and then there are dispatchers who call. The dispatchers are likely to be native, and the taxi driver are likely to be immigrant. Again, in order to illustrate that this is not a theory, this really comes out of analyzing the data and observing, let me just give you this, explain you this correlation. So in this graph, I have plot on the horizontal axis what percentage of immigrants in the low education group each state has in the United States. These are data of 2010, but would be similar more frequently. And in the vertical axis, I have put an index of how intense is the use of manual type of skills relative to communication for native worker in that state. So what does this say? This is an incredibly strong and negative correlation if you put. This says that in states where there are a lot of immigrants, native have moved out of manual job and they have moved more into type of communication and interaction type of job. So in California, the landscaper, the gardeners, the agricultural workers, the construction workers are immigrants in large part. And the native, as a consequence, have not lost their job. they have upgraded and changed the type of occupation to coordinator, supervisors, salesperson, and interactor. But in Kentucky and Mississippi, where this has not happened, the natives do all the way to the manual jobs, and therefore, as a consequence on their wages, is that given that this job don't pay as much as the communication interaction, they have actually, the native have a wage disadvantage down there. Another important dimension in which the immigrants are different is this that I was telling you, that they are much younger than the natives. They will age, but they come in when are young. So if you take the distribution of immigrant workers by age, foreign-born, this is the distribution in year 2000. If you just take the working age from 18 and older until 100 years old, the red distribution is the distribution of natives. You see that the native worker have a peak in the 50, 55, 60 group of age. These are the baby boomers. This is a big number. While the immigrants have a peak much younger, at 26, 30 years of age. So being younger, of course, they will not only in the labor market supply some type of jobs that are typical of younger worker, but also in terms of social security, they will contribute for longer. They will have a long history, starting quite young, of contribution. So in the balance of the social security, they can be pretty valuable. As I said, immigrants are also much more mobile in the United States than natives. Again, there is a lot of study that shows that when a state goes in a boom and another in a recession, the first people to move are the foreign-born. And this is a very good mechanism to smooth and accommodate boom and recession. So it reduces the impact of a recession in a state if when the recession hits, native go away when there are no jobs. And so the unemployment rate decreases and they go where there are jobs. And then, more interesting, this has been under research, although now we are looking, just the fact that they're different from a cultural, from an individual point of view implies that in some sectors, they have brought a variety of goods to the United States that has increased massively the expenditure of Americans. Think of the restaurant sector, just in simple, and economists believe that the increased willingness of Americans to pay for the sector comes in part for the larger variety that has been brought by these different people. So up to now, I have talked about the low educated. Now, what about the scientist and engineer? Well, here I would say that almost every economist will tell you that the productivity growth of a rich country like the United States comes essentially mostly from innovation in science and technology. So having more of these science and technology people increases innovation and productivity. And in the last 20 years, the way in which most of these immigrant highly skilled have come in the United States is through this H1B Visa Program, which is the program for skilled immigrants, which is temporary. But a lot of them have actually found a way of staying by renewing, getting a green card for work or family reason. Now, let me give you sort of an idea of how important has been foreign scientists and engineers for the American science. So these are STEM workers, science, technology, engineering, and math workers as a percentage of total employment, divided in immigrant, blue, and native. So they're a small percentage, right? There are not very many scientists and engineers in the country. Here, in 1980, they were about 2% of the population. But in 1980, of these 2%, 1 out of 10 workers was a foreign-born in science and engineering. Now, this is the period in which the H1B program was in place, and the whole growth of science engineer as a percentage of the labor force of employment, the whole growth, if you look at this number, has been driven by immigrants, really. Now, immigrants, 1 out of 3 scientists and engineers, almost 1 out of, a little bit more than 1 out of 4 is foreign-born, and the whole growth in the last 20 years of science and technology in highly educated people doing science and technology has been driven by this. So, as I said, this has been brought by the H1B Visa Program. And the H1B Visa Program has been an odd program in a sense, because it has been, the number of people admitted through it have been changed a little bit sort of arbitrarily. So this is the cap of number of people who were admitted with the H1B. First it was set around at 65,000. Then towards the end of the 2000 was increased because of the technology boom. And then after September 11, it was brought down significantly, actually after 2004, after the boost of that. And then right now stands at 85,000. Some groups were made exempt from this, so university people are not, this is for private companies, so that's why the actual number of H1B goes up. But what we did in a study was we used this policy variation of the cap, and we used a very different distribution of these scientists and engineering among American cities in order to estimate how important they are for productivity in cities, how much they contribute. So again, this is I just wanted to give you an idea a little bit. This is a recent paper that we've published in which we take the number of H1B visas which have been given to foreign-born, and we use the fact that out of the 280 metropolitan area in the United States, some received a lot of them and others received much fewer of them because of the pre-existing network of migrants that let information and circulate. And then we analyze the effects of receiving a lot or few of these foreign science and engineer. We analyze the effect on the wages and on the employment of native workers in this city. So think of a city like San Francisco, like the Bay Area, like San Jose, that receives a lot of these people, and a city like Cincinnati, Ohio, that receive very few of them. Obviously, there are many other differences among these cities, so you need to worry about controlling for a zillion of things, trying to identify causality. And I would be very happy to discuss about what we do here, trying to identify just the policy variation of H1B as the causation of these changes. But what we find here, I just wanted to give you an idea of the numbers of the entities. We estimate the impact of an increase of foreign-born by 1% of employment on the wage of native scientists, the wage of native college-educated, the wage of native non-college-educated, and then we also estimate their impact on the employment. Are they displacing native scientists so that they're not there? On employment of native scientists and college-educated and non-college-educated. So the standard error is in parentheses, and the stars mean this is significantly different from zero statistically. What jumps to your eyes is that there are two very positive and significant effects of this, of having more of these over 20 years, of having more of these scientists. They increase the productivity and therefore the wage of the highly educated American worker. 1% more increases productivity and wages by 8% for college educated. But they also increase a little bit. They don't hurt the less educated. So technological progress and productivity helped both the more educated and the less educated. And they did not have any effect on employment. So they did not displace the scientists and engineer, the American scientists and engineer that were doing this job. They just increased the ability to innovate and therefore the productivity growth without creating this displacement. And that makes sense, right? Because these people, again, you can think of them as creating innovation, opportunity that don't hurt employment and help the productivity of a city. 5, 10? 10. So this gives a little bit an idea of how relevant and through which channel immigrants can improve productivity, specialization, innovation, and labor market outcome really of native. There are other works here, I just cite 3, but let me emphasize another channel through which this complementarity of immigrant has been studied. A lot of immigrants at the low level of the education spectrum are in the so-called home service type of sector. They're cleaning the house, they're assisting, their child care, their elderly care. And there are a couple of very interesting studies that show that this has allowed educated women, highly educated women, to participate more in the labor force. Affordable presence of affordable care and service in the house has pushed more women, and especially educated ones, into the labor force with a gain for the economy because they are productive. And then there are other studies that look at how immigrants affect the availability and the price of local services, making them potentially more available. So far I've only talked about the gains that immigration may entail for the receiving country, which I've been spending a lot of time researching because ultimately the receiving country are the one that makes the policy and decide how many of these people you get in. So in a sense, if you want to make a case for immigration, you need to make a case for the receiving country. However, it's pretty clear that migration can be a potential tremendous opportunity for the migrants and their family and their country of origin. And here let me list a few lines of studies that people have pursued. First, For the migrant, there is overwhelming evidence that the possibility of migrating increases the income and the upward mobility. These people move from country where their wage is 4, 5, 6 times smaller, so an increase of their wages by 4, 5 times, 6 times, moving to a rich country. There is much more study in the last years of this circular migration. A lot of migrants don't stay in the country where they go forever. Europe has been a very good example of it. Most of the Eastern Europeans who have come to the Western Europe, they have not stayed. The Romanian, Polish, they've gone back. And they've gone back with more human capital. And so in a sense, they have learned, they have created ties, and then they've gone back. And this economically is an opportunity. First, because they create network, and there is research showing that the trade between countries that are linked by immigration increase a lot. So there is more export and import. And again, if you think that this will increase the availability of goods and productivity of a country, this is good. But also they will increase, with their increased human capital and ability, the productivity once back. And then, of course, what everybody looks at, for some countries, remittances, which are the money that the immigrants send home, can be very big. In the Philippines, remittances is about 10% of the gross domestic product, which is very large. So, having given this picture, let me use the last 5 minutes to talk about the proposed reform and how all that I have said is or is not, would or would not be improved by the passing of this reform. So, first of all, this reform, which has been passed at the Senate Bill S-744, and now is sitting at the House, I'm not sure with any possibility of passing. As the way, again, from an economic point of view, there are 3 very important provisions that will impact economically the United States. The first is that the bill introduces a provisional status and then a path to legal status for the undocumented. The second is that it introduces a new visa for low-skilled immigrants. The cap of the visa initially is relatively low, it's 20,000, but if there is demand, it can be increased all the way up to 200,000. And the interesting thing is that the law considers the possibility of a committee increasing the cap following the labor market demand for this type of jobs. And then the third thing that is done is increases the cap for the highly skilled worker to back essentially to where it was in the early 2000s, to 110,000 from 65,000. So it almost doubles this. So let's see what each one of these things will do. Undocumented. Now, the undocumented, the number of undocumented in the US is estimated around 10, 11, 12 million, depending on which estimate you look at. But one thing we really know, undocumented have increased a lot in the 90s and in the early 2000s, but their growth has essentially stalled in the last 10, not even more, maybe in the last 7, 8 years. The reason of this stall is this is the Great Recession, so obviously the economy didn't attract as many, but also the border has been very strongly militarized and almost sealed. And third, the most important thing that not everybody knows, but I think is the most important reason, is that the Mexican population, a lot of these undocumented were coming from Mexico, the Mexican population has had a huge demographic transition. And while the generation of young people in their 20s in the 90s was very big, then the fertility rate have dropped from 5 per woman to 2 per woman. And so the young generation, only young people really migrate a lot, is much smaller, and so the number of potential migrants has decreased a lot. What would the reform do for this undocumented? Well, the reform will give to 7, 8 million, so in theory everybody can qualify, but the reform requires that a person, so gives this temporal status to undocumented if they prove that they have been in the country for 3 years. And allow them right away to work legally. That's the only thing that allows them really to do right away. Full access to the labor market. Not full access to welfare benefit, not full access to any other citizenship benefit, only to the labor market. However, and then the road is long, it's about 11 years before they can apply for permanent resident. But I think from an economic point of view, the immediate thing they will do by making them fully mobile and fully visible in the labor market will allow them to find better jobs, to match them with higher quality jobs and increase their wages. So estimate is that they will become a little richer. Given that they are less uncertain, these people, because now they're not threatened to go away next year, they have more incentive to invest in human capital, in training, language, schooling for their kids as well. And finally, by increasing their income, they increase their tax pay capacity. The Congressional Budget Office estimates actually that there will be a net surplus in the next 12 years for the US. What are the benefits from instituting the temporary W visa for unskilled work? The benefits are that finally this creates a channel to allow those people who had to come in essentially undocumented before. Because there is this large demand for manual job that Americans are moving out from, and at the current wages, this large demand unmatched by supply has generated this big pressure. The W visa allows legal entry, and so reduces the pressure for undocumented entry in this type of jobs. At the same time, the W visa is structured such that you can be temporary, but you can apply for permanent citizenship. So it can be a channel for becoming also a permanent citizen, which will make some of these people come in, work, invest, and if they want to stay, apply, or if they want to go back, go back. And as I said, it has this interesting cap, which depends on labor market conditions. So for an economist, this is also something that makes sense. The higher the demand, the more is the number of people you allow. And then, finally, what are the benefits from the increased H1B? Again, as I said, more highly educated will improve and continue to drive American science and technology. And probably in the long run, given that these people really seem to affect innovation, technology, and productivity, they can have a permanent positive effect on the wage and income per capita of American people. And also the new reform introduces, besides the H1B cap, which is raised, introduces a number of visa, of green cards, of permanent permits, which are allocated on labor, on merit reason, meaning if you have skills that are highly valuable and they extend, they increase, they create 200,000 new green cards for those. So let me just conclude with saying, I painted this picture. The opportunity, I think, are massive, are good, and are interesting of having more migrants in the United States. However, I started saying what makes migrants very attractive from an economic point of view, that they're different. The same thing is what can create some issues on other respects. The difference, on one hand, we like differences because increase the potential and the productivity. On the other, they may create some issue of assimilation. So it's true that migrants at the low end of the labor market come in at low wages. And we don't like having very unequal income distribution. And they are, maybe their opportunity to climb up is a little harder. Having different people sometimes reduces willingness to cooperate. There are some studies that say that redistribution, which is taxing the rich to give to the poor, becomes less agreed upon, becomes more controversial when the poor are of a different type, in a sense, and this can create things. And so, what are the things that can reduce this type of problem? What I think are some policies that could reduce, and I think the current bill does a good job. For instance, I think it's very important to admit a balanced mix of high skill and low skill from a country, of immigrant for a country. Just as the bill says, there needs to be the W visa and the H1B. Why? Because if from Mexico you have the engineers and you have the workers, then internally the community has the right incentive. A Mexican can become an engineer, the right model, and the citizen perceive they as contributing on these two parts of the society, which makes them more valued. Second, I think it's very good to have a system which gives more importance to labor markets in terms of migration. Right now, the American system is essentially based on family reunification, which is noble and which is good, but there is a ton of research that shows that immigrants that go with a job end up integrating better, having a more upward mobility. So I think labor markets, access to labor market and job for migration for job is good. And finally, I think that what's important for the second generation to integrate and not to become a burden, but become a value, is to make sure that the access to school and the upward mobility of the second generation makes them similar to the rest, the remaining. And again, here it's very hard to know what improves this, but I would say that probably schooling is one of the strongest push to vertical mobility. So to conclude, immigration has a huge potential for growth. It opens up possibility. Not everyone is a winner in immigration, but there are very big opportunity for having a big chunk of the American society to actually gain from this, and the migrants themselves. Certainly, the immigration policies at this point need to be brought up to speed, and if not this reform, we definitely need some reform of this system, which has become very old, very stagnant, and has created a couple of very big problems, among which the undocumented one. That's what I have for now.
Are there any questions? I have one.
Yep.
I like that there is the opportunity to be working like with documents or under this like visa, but then I'm concerned about the welfare. You mentioned that they would be paying taxes, but then they wouldn't be able to get any welfare benefits. And so with education, like in order for children to be educated, they have to have their basics. And I'm just worried that they might fall under like the poverty line. And so what would, help them like welfare? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, you are. So sorry, what do I do? Take some question or do an answer after question? Let's start answering directly, and then we'll see if there are too many. Okay. Yeah, so the solution to the undocumented problem is a little bit of a compromise. And there were a lot of people who were saying, if you make it so hard for these people, a long path with no access to welfare, you risk to have a lot of them who will not succeed in becoming citizens, and that's going to be a problem. On the other hand, a lot of people wanted, the only way they were allowing this is by having these people sort of go through some, pay a little bit of this cost of being undocumented. So I think that, so let me give you two things. So first, the access to education is not really, so education should be accessible. Already right now, actually, for children of people who are undocumented, most states have stepped in and they've said, in California, you cannot deny education to a kid because he comes from an undocumented family or because he's undocumented himself. So states, I think, will do more of that. So in terms of education, which I think is key, definitely this will be, their access to education is not going to be hurt by this, and it's certainly not going to be less than it is right now. Probably it's going to be more. Second, they don't have access to welfare, so they want to have access to measure like food stamps, like unemployment insurance, this type of measure, which implies, in a sense, yes, that they could be poorer. On the other hand, they will have huge incentive to work. If you look at the undocumented, the employment rate of undocumented is massively higher than the employment rate of American in similar level of education. And the reason is that because these people sort of cannot sit down and wait for welfare. They don't have it, and so they have to. So on one hand, yes, there is the risk. On the other, there is an incentive that most of them have overcome by actually working. The third question is, what's the alternative? The alternative, I think, is the status quo to this potential, and the status quo certainly does not give them any perspective and any guarantee of being treated fairly. Right now, they're not being treated fairly even in the labor market because they have no rights in the labor market. With this reform, they will right away become a worker as the others. So for instance, their wage will go up because their bargaining power will go up a little bit. They will not be any more scared to report some abuse on the labor place. So it's a step, clearly, but balancing, I would say, the incentive and the fairness, I don't think is a bad step. I think it's a step in the right direction. Yes, two-person. Yeah, you and in front of you. Maybe you were the first and then.
Okay. I was curious, you showed that statistic at the beginning from the Pew poll that 20-30% of people around the world want to immigrate to the United States. And you make the argument that one of the possible benefits for migrants is that they experience an increase in income and upward mobility. But how do you square that 23% number with the kind of empirical reality that upward mobility in the United States isn't the same as what it is in other developed countries?
Yes. So for the migrant, the biggest chunk of upward mobility is just from going to their country to the United States. So even if in the United States they're stuck at a wage which is relatively low, this wage, so if you take a person who comes from rural China or the rural Philippines and picks tomatoes there, they probably get 20 cents per hour working there. In the US, they get $8 per hour. So it's a 20 times or 40 times increase in what they earn. So the first big mobility is that. I think the mobility you're talking about, which is an issue in the United States, which has decreased in the last 20 years, is going to be a big issue for the second generation. The first generation is usually, comparing themselves with the people left behind, is usually happy of coming. They are the success story. They increase. Their children, however, they are American in a sense, on one hand. On the other, if they start from a disadvantage point and they don't converge, are a problem. That's the story of Europe, of France and Germany. France and Germany, a group of immigrants who came in the 60s, who came for working reason, the Turkish, the Algerian, and their children, essentially, they didn't converge in terms of wage, education, to the average French of German. And this is creating a huge social strain in the country. So the mobility, the vertical mobility, I think, will be key for the second generation. And I agree. I mean, the American economy has to start creating that. And how you do that, we have no idea. But I agree with you, that is a big issue for the second generation, I think. Yes?
So if given legal status to undocumented people is not bad for the economy, why is it so hard? Why don't they want to pass the law?
So I guess you're overestimating the power of economists. That is good for the economy. I think there is overwhelming evidence on several aspects. I think the reason is the ideological reason that gets this process stuck is this idea that these people have violated the law at some point and needs to be punished, quote unquote. But the current plan is no amnesty in any form. These people have to be 12 years in this provisional status in which they pay taxes, they pay back taxes, they pay fee, and they have no access to the welfare state. So this is very different from coming in regularly. Moreover, for 12 years, they have to work. They have to show when, after 12 years, they apply for the residence, that they have worked. So in a sense, this type of provision makes them very valuable for the American economy. The Congressional Budget Office has calculated what net benefit for the government they will be in terms of tax paid versus welfare received, and they are a very net positive benefit for the US government. Only 12 years from now, when they will start maybe drawing from this, but in present discounted value, they will have paid massively their way in. So I think the economists you talk to, at least the one I know, most of them, and they do an evaluation from an economic point of view, they all are very in agreement that this makes a lot of sense, this reform. But I mean, right now the real problem is that the House of Representatives is not going to vote for it because there is a group of Republicans in the House who will not vote for it, given that their local constituents sort of thinks that the undocumented are the root of all problems for some reason. So nothing to do really with the economy.
What do you mean by welfare? Like, I understand just straight welfare, but if you're paying unemployment taxes, you're not going to get unemployment.
So the unemployment.
Like what actually?
Sorry, the unemployment is a state administered. So none of the federal programs. So yeah, TANF, food stamps, earned income tax credit. Those they won't have access to those. And they will. So the unemployment insurance, I guess, is a state by state decision. Well, for instance, they don't have access to the exchange, the state exchange in the new Obama Care Act. So they won't have access to that. They will have to purchase private health insurance.
Go to school.
Yes. So school is absolutely. Education is out, and Social Security. They will be paying into Social Security, and they will be earning into Social Security. So they will have access to, if they stay in the country, and if they become permanent residents, of course they will have access to Social Security because they're paying. And all of these people. So the estimates are that out of the 11 million I saw that are in here, these provisions are relatively tough enough that they don't think that more than 7, 8 million people will actually really become, but many more will try. So in a sense, in aggregate, there will be even more net positive fiscal inflow because some people will pay some of these costs, and then at some point they will decide that they go back, or they will decide that they remain undocumented. So that's a delicate issue. But I was talking mainly about federal access, while schooling, healthcare, and Social Security they will going to. Yeah.
I was just wondering on the mid-level jobs, the second-level jobs, the supervisory jobs, did you have any data on how many of those are actually going to second-generation immigrants, you know, as far as the
Right.
ability for the second generation?
So that's interesting. We don't have as good information on the second generation of immigrants because the census, the American census, has stopped asking the question about what is the country of origin of your parents we have the 80, 90, 2000. So now you're asked, what are your ancestry? And you can say, I'm from Sweden 200 years ago. So in the 90s, 2000, we don't know as well how the second generation has done. The studies that I've seen that look at how the children of immigrants, do they look more like native or do they look more like immigrant in their occupational choice? I actually seen this for the high end, for the educated people. For instance, it looks like the children of immigrants who are highly educated, and as I told you, a lot of them are scientists, they tend to have a little higher propensity than native worker to stay in science. They are kind of in between, the second generation. Okay, the American, highly educated, have low percentage participation into science and technology and engineering. The immigrant very high. The second generation is somewhat in between. And so in there, for instance, the Asian, which is the one which has the highest propensity to go in science and technology, their children are still significantly more likely to be engineer and to be in technical type of occupation, but not as their parents. In between, there is a little bit of a mean reversion starting from up. So that's all I know about this intermediate occupation. It would be very interesting to see sort of how much of this preference for some job is transmitted, is cultural transmitted, and how much is just the exposure to a different market, which is the US. We don't know too much about that. Yeah?
Yeah, thank you. The main players that you described were employers, employees, and the government, whatever its policies are. But we're missing the labor unions in that scenario, and one can easily, see why or say why. But what would be how does that play out? And a number of questions could be asked. Are we going to have more or less of labor unions?
Yeah.
Where are they going to be concentrated? Low end, and all that kind of stuff. There is a successful story in the SEIU, but that's just one area, and so what do we look forward to in terms of labor union policy and attitude?
So my position on this is that, so first, the unionization of the American labor market in general has decreased a lot in the last 30 years, right? 30 years ago, maybe 30–40% of the labor force were unionized. Now I think we're around 10–12%. So naturally, a lot of things have decreased. And I agree with you, some union have changed a lot their position on immigration. ACLU was relatively against immigration in protection of the domestic worker in the 90s, and now they are among the actors who have actually had an active part in negotiating this bill, and they have understood. I think that unions have understood that if they don't open up themselves up to the immigrant worker in some occupations, they're going to be essentially squeezed out of the market, because in agriculture, already there are no union anymore. In California, all the work is done by this sort of intermediary which are hiring. So they have been really squeezed out. But in construction, in applied manufacturing, I think the union will have to play the role that either they become the organizer of some of these immigrant workers and they try to negotiate for them and with them what they have negotiated before for the native, or progressively they try to keep them out in some occupation. My feeling is that they will be squeezed out. So the role will depend on what ACLU seems to have gone the way of trying to consider immigrant as their next generation of worker, in a sense. And I don't see how else it can be in some occupation which are largely becoming heavily immigrant. Yes?
I haven't read every single paragraph of the Senate Bill 744.
Mm-hmm.
What happens, because we've had a business cycle about every 6–7 years, we have a recession.
Mm-hmm.
So let us say in 6 years, and let us say the immigration reform passes at the beginning of the year. Say 5 or 6 years from now, we have another recession. What is the provisions for immigrant workers in a situation where unemployment spikes again?
So,
say 14% or something to that effect. God forbid we get to Spain.
Right. So the new visa system that they have created. So the big thing will happen is that in a recession, the number of new immigrants under those visas that can come in will go down quite a bit. Which is not too bad because they go down in any case. In the recession, even if you don't have an automatic stabilizer, they go down. What will happen to workers who are in here? Well, so on a temporary visa, when you're here on a temporary visa, both high-skilled or low-skilled, you need to have a job. And these actually, both the high and the low, has this interesting provision that allows you some unemployment period, but it's relatively tight. I think it's 3 months. You have to find a job within 3 months. Otherwise, your visa decay and you need to leave the country. So these relatively strict rules are in there because, for right or for wrong, I think the perception of the natives is always that when there is unemployment and a crisis, they always immediately say, why there are these foreign-born taking our jobs? And so I think the idea that a foreign worker on a visa will be here if he or she works is tied into this new visa, category which are in there. For the undocumented, if the process has started and the undocumented are on a provisional legal status, the risk of a big recession is that their big recession may prevent them from having that continual working history that they need in order to get the green card at the end of the period. If there is a massive recession as the one that hit in 2008, I cannot not imagine that there would be an exception done for that, because in that recession, people who had been employed always had lost. So I cannot imagine that somebody would say, well, come on, but we're really being incredibly unfair here. But nothing is guaranteed, and so another big recession could de facto prevent a lot of these people from fulfilling all the requirements to become documented. That's what a lot of people say, this is really tough on them. And it could be really uncertain that a lot of them get the green card because of this uncertainty. Yeah.
So they're very business cycle vulnerable in that.
They are business cycle vulnerable, and another margin of adjustment that I can think of is that in a recession, just to work, they may be willing to accept really relatively low, quite low wages, because they really need this job in a sense to be there. So they are vulnerable from that point of view. And how are we going to deal with that? If the next 10 years are like the 90s, no recession and nice growth, I think this problem will not be there. But if they're like the 2000s, then yes, we will have a problem. Yes?
I just want to jump in on that because I was supporting a lot of the DC groups when they were negotiating this, and there was a very conscious decision to not try to get language in the actual bill that would spell out in high recessionary periods, we loosen the restrictions on the undocumented workers. And the strategy is, if this thing ever gets passed, in the regulation writing, right, when the bill passes, there's a ton of implementation stuff that has to get specified. You know, just reams and reams of programs and policies. And this is one of the big ones that advocates are focused on.
That's interesting. So they will want to write a thing that
it's under the radar
to allow for
It won't be a political.
It makes sense to allow for an exception if something like happened there, but don't put it in the law so that people don't have to vote. Already controversial enough as it is. Makes sense. Yeah. Nice point.
I had a quick question for you. Can you give a sort of a layperson's explanation of folks like Borjas and other economists who are still arguing that there are negative effects on U.S. foreign workers?
Yes. So.
And what the difference is between what sort of new generation of economists is finding in those?
Yes. Good question. So I really think that among the academic economists, people who really publish stuff in academia and also go out and talk with policymakers, I think that most of the people will 90% agree that the new results are this. So George Borjas has spent a lot of time focusing on one particular effect, which is this effect of competition of immigrants at the low end of the wage and employment. Even in his paper, which are so, the result that gets publicized is there is a negative effect, but if you look at all the paper, he finds this very localized negative impact on, say, the bottom 10% of workers, and then everybody else in his paper too has gains from complementarity from this. I think, though, the real change has been a methodological one. He has only been focused on a model, which is the labor demand, labor supply model, quite static, quite neoclassical, and sort of very simple. Now, new people have come in and say, look, but there can be some productivity effect. People change specialization. There are dynamic responses. And now, firm hire this worker and moves a native in other words. I think that all these new models have become better and capturing this non-pure neoclassical labor demand, effect on productivity, on specialization, on this complementarity type of effect. And I think the last 10 years of literature has focused more on this complementary dynamic effect. So he had a little bit of this competition effect he's talking about are static and they're still there. Now you put on the estimate of this dynamic and this complementary effect, and when you put the two together, you find that at the low end of the spectrum, there is neither a big positive nor a negative. There is a small effect. And then there is positive effect on the wage of the other worker. So that's how I would summarize. I would say that his relative effect, he has been very careful in his career just to identify this shift in labor demand and supply, keeping everything else constant, which is a useful exercise in academia to understand and think. But then if you look at what migration changes, it changes the way firm produce things, it changes the way native are specialized. When you start re-putting back into the model these things, you see that a lot of these negative effects are offset by some of the positive. And I think that's where we stand. We have learned to measure better this positive impact, and therefore those static negative effects, which some of which are there, are in part offset, and for some category are more than offset, and so we have some of this positive effect. That would be my summary. Yes?
So I'm curious to know what your economic perspective would be on Jerry Brown's new immigration bills that have passed this month. So, things like giving immigrants license, giving them the ability to be licensed lawyers. How is that going to, increase or decrease, our benefit?
Yeah. So, I mean, Jerry Brown and the individual states are trying to fill in for the federal government, not making the big decision. So I think that essentially what he has done, the package of measures, I think the important one, this driver license one seems important, is to give a little bit more access to the undocumented, a little bit more access to the labor market and in general to the undocumented. I think this is good. So with the driver license, you can at least keep a job that require you to drive. And you're not just segmented in those very few occupations, which are probably agriculture. So from an economic point of view, good, because these people could better express their productivity in the labor market. They could upgrade their job. They could earn a little bit more. So I think from an economic point of view, will be good. The question will be, I think, then in the future is, so will this also attract some, if California becomes more, if the federal government doesn't do anything, and California becomes relatively a little bit more friendly and opens a little bit more the market to the undocumented, will undocumented from elsewhere come in? There is this study that undocumented are leaving Arizona. In fact, also some documented Latino are leaving Arizona because of the tough measure that they have been passing. And I think this is an interesting opportunity, really. Some state can say, look, there is good business to be done here. If these people can access opportunity. Unfortunately, ultimately, they will not be able to grant the legal status. And I think this is a big hurdling block. So what do I think about states going their way when the federal government doesn't? On one end, I see, could be beneficial. The risk to me is that the government doesn't see the real need of doing this. And I think if nobody does anything and they keep pushing the federal government, maybe there is more pressure. But this is really a little speculation. So I am actually positively, I think that the economic impact of Jerry Brown's measure license will be positive, but I don't know that that in the long run is the right strategy to have. I would like him to go there and pound. Well, he cannot do anything. But they're actually, I just read that some California Republicans are among the first who have said that they will pass, well, the House version of, which is relatively similar to the Senate one of the reform. So that would be good. The California Republican should say, we're going to want to pass a general reform, and we're going to try to tilt the trend of the Republican Party.
No more questions? Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. It's fun.